Good evening. My name is Mekhla Krishnamurthy, and I am a member of the faculty at Ashoka University, where I teach sociology and anthropology. On behalf of Ashoka University, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the second session of Beyond the Classroom, our special series of live and interactive virtual seminars. At Ashoka, a liberal arts university funded entirely by private and collective philanthropy, we are constantly expanding our understanding of what it means to strive for excellence in education. Now, more than ever, at a time of such great uncertainty and crisis for the world, we feel that adaptation, innovation, and inclusion are vital to this pursuit. This is our effort then to take the learning process outside the walls of the Ashoka classroom to a wider public. It is also a way for us to share with you the great joy, intellectual rigor, and quest for excellence that drives us all at Ashoka. Every Wednesday and Saturday at 8:30 p.m., a member of the Ashoka faculty will speak to you on a subject that they are passionate about and invite you to ask your questions in an interactive discussion that follows. Tonight, I am delighted to introduce you to Nayanjot Lahiri, Professor of History at Ashoka University. Professor Lahiri, who completed her BA from St. Stephen's College, New Delhi, and earned her Ph.D. from Delhi University, is a leading scholar of ancient India, Indian archaeology, and heritage studies. Her book, Ashoka in Ancient India, was awarded the John F. Richards Prize by the American Historical Association for the best book in South Asian history in 2016. She is also recipient of the prestigious Infosys Prize for her contributions to the humanities and the field of archaeology. Her talk today is titled, Why Study, Love and Laughter. Hi, Nayanjot. It's so great to see you.
Hi, Nicola. The first time we are meeting like this online.
Yes.
And thank you so much for introducing me.
No,
Great.
and what a wonderful, exciting topic you have chosen for all of us. I was reading somewhere that historically pandemics produce this sort of gallows humor, this dark humor in society. So it's just absolutely lovely to have you talk about love and laughter at this time.
Yeah, I hope in the course of this lecture, you will get a sense that it may also be very nice to talk about love and laughter in a more light-hearted way rather than in terms of the dark humor of pandemics.
Yes, no, it's absolutely wonderful and so exciting. I know that everybody will be very keen to get started with the seminar. So I'm just going to give you two very quick pieces of housekeeping. Professor Lahiri will give a short presentation for about 20 minutes, after which you can ask questions. You can either use, give your name using the Q&A function on Zoom. You can send in your name with the question, or you can post it anonymously. All the seminars will be recorded and uploaded on our website, and we'll be sharing the link with you shortly. So without further ado, I will turn over the screen to Professor Nayanjot Lahiri for her talk. And Nayanjot, don't forget to share your screen when you have to.
All right. Thank you, Mekhla. Thank you very
Looking forward
much.
to your talk. Bye-bye.
Bye. So hello, everybody. Can you see me?
Yes, you're completely visible.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be speaking today about love and laughter. I've often done this in the Ashoka classroom, but this is the first time I'll be doing it beyond the classroom, and I'm very excited about it and how those of you who've tuned in will respond to this. I think it's a very good time to be talking about this subject. I, at least, through these weeks, have realized how I'm really somebody who's become emotion-driven. I go through a day which is full of happiness, but also anxiety and depression. I've often felt the craving to just go to India Gate for an ice cream, something as simple as that, which can't be done, or shanglo around on a shopping street. And in the course of the next 20 minutes, I'm going to try to get you to see why it's important to speak about emotions, why are emotions important in history. surely, if they're important in our lives today, as I'm going to show you, they're important even when we study human lives in the past. Now, very quickly, how did I come to this? What got me interested in this subject? Actually, I was very curious about jokes. And I often ask myself the question that, well, where was the first joke collection put together? And I now have an answer, which is on the screen. And it was actually a joke book called Philogelos, which literally means the lover of laughter. It's a collection of some very funny jokes, some 265 of them. And this is from the Greco-Roman world. The compilation originally was put together in the 4th or 5th century CE, although the big manuscript that we have is some centuries later. Now, apart from the jokes being very funny, what for me is even funnier is that the lead in half the jokes is taken by a creature called the scholasticos, or egghead. Some of you might know that an egghead is somebody who's very learned, but the egghead in this collection is often shown to be somebody who is foolish by reason of his learning. So to just give you one instance of a joke, there was a scholasticos who did not have a pillow. So he asked his slave to get him a jar. So when the slave said that, don't you think this is going to be a little hard to sleep on? The scholasticos actually thought about it for a long time. And then he said, you're absolutely right. Make sure when you bring the jar, you actually line it with feathers. So, you know, this is a good lesson for those of us who made a career out of learning to realize that actually learned people can also be very foolish. But the other question that I've often thought about is that how are jokes, from ancient antiquity in the West different from, let's say, a Chinese joke? And let's read this particular joke together. This is from China. It's called No Wine in an Old Bottle. There was once a rich man who had a reputation as a skinflint. One day he sent his servant to buy wine, handing him a bottle, but no money. The servant asked, Master, how can I possibly purchase wine without any money? The miser replied angrily, anyone can buy things with money. It takes a wise man to obtain wine without paying for it. The servant went away with the bottle and soon came back with it still empty. He said to his master, here is the wine. The niggardly old man was so enraged when he discovered an empty bottle before him that he cursed his servant. This is really outrageous. The bottle is empty. What shall I drink? The servant replied, anyone can drink if there is wine in the bottle. You are indeed a capable man if you can get wine out of an empty bottle. Now, why I like this particular joke a lot is because apart from being funny, it also gives you a sense that jokes are much more than just about mere humor. Here you can very clearly see how, somebody who is low in terms of a class station can actually turn the tables. The servant can turn the tables on his master. And at least figuratively speaking, can in the process overturn class relations. So looking at jokes from different parts of the world, this is something that I do as a part of my Love and Laughter course, and it really is great fun. But beyond this, I think one thing that I feel by looking at Love and Laughter that you get a sense of is how some of the greats in history, both ancient and modern, actually wrote about such light-hearted subjects. So when you think of this gentleman, the great philosopher Plato, you often think about the Republic or about dialogues. But I think Plato also talked about love. And there's a type of love which he talked about that is non-sexual. It's therefore called platonic love. And he spoke about, in that context, how important it was and how the ideal love involves soul attraction, attraction because minds shared a great deal, rather than the carnal attraction that exists towards individual bodies. But what about this great Charles Darwin? Now, when you think about Darwin, you think about the evolution of living beings. He spent decades putting all this together. But do you know that he also wrote at length about emotions in animals and men? And in that context, he wrote at length about tickling. So he was of the opinion that tickling provided a physical provocation for laughter, which is absolutely correct, but that there were certain rules that had to be followed. So, for instance, you cannot tickle yourself, he believed, and that's absolutely correct. Because if you try auto-tickling, you will realize that there is no element of surprise, so you won't laugh. Similarly, you just cannot tickle any body part of your victim. It has to be that body part which is usually not touched often. So it can be the belly, it can be the armpits, it can be the soles of one's feet. He also spoke about the fact that you can only tickle your friends. You can't tickle, for instance, strangers or enemies. Because in that context, what would happen is that it would be seen by a stranger or an enemy as a very real provocation. Whereas in fact, when you are tickling, the provocation is really only bogus. So love and laughter are themes through which you can actually look at the ideas and philosophies of a whole lot of names that you're familiar with. It's just that you're not aware that they also spoke about subjects like this. Beyond these reasons, I think historically, what is it that we as scholars of the past can contribute to the study of love and laughter? This is something I've thought about a great deal. And I think as you look at love and laughter in comparative perspective, you get a sense that what are the ways of expressing emotions in one culture may not necessarily be the manner in which you express the same emotions elsewhere. So look at this mosaic. It's a mosaic from Pompeii. And you can see here musicians who are actually street artists. And the street artists are, of course, wearing masks, but the expressions that they've chosen for the masks are very happy expressions. They are laughing, they're looking quite mirthful. On the other hand, if you compare this picture with another one from the Roman world, this is the visage of a senator. This is what Roman senators look like. So when you're talking about the Roman elite, you talk about free men. And if you were a free man, you had to appear in a particular way. So if there was a statue being made of you, you couldn't really appear as these street artists did, which is looking full of laughter and happiness. You had to actually look very somber. You had to look dignified. There had to be great composure. You had to look like the head of a patriarchal household. So in other words, you had to be unsmiling. So the point is, and you had hundreds of such statues all over the Roman world. And from this, you get a sense that the higher you went in the social ladder, the more grim you appeared in the statues that immortalized you. And the lower you were on the social scale, you could giggle and laugh in public. Now, the point is that do you see such a thing in India at all? Actually, you see this with reference to one religion, and that is Buddhism. Some years ago, a famous paper was written by Michael Kaskin. It's called Real Buddhas Don't Laugh. And if you read that paper, you get a sense that in the rules that were framed for monks by the Buddha, there's a particularly dim view of laughter that you see. There are actually strictures against laughing out loud, and lots of them. And these rules and strictures are actually conveyed through stories. So one of the stories goes, at that time, a group of 6 monks, laughing a great deal, went amidst the houses, to which the Buddha said, "Not with loud laughter will I go amidst the houses," is a training to be observed. Now, why would the Buddha do this? He really felt that unrestrained laughter was very un-Buddhist, because Buddhism is supposed to make people aloof and restrained in their passions. And if you actually look at the strictures against laughing, you realize that what is even worse is if you show your teeth and your gums, and if there is some kind of uncontrolled movement of the body when you smile or laugh. And, this is why, if you look at all the statues and images that you have of the Buddha, you will rarely ever find a smiling Buddha in South Asia. This is the kind of Buddha that you normally see. Very contemplative, but very somber. This is an image which is there in the Mathura Museum. And this is what a lot of the images of the Buddha looked like. Now, on the other hand, if you look at images in East Asia, that is in places like Japan and in China, actually there, and this is a few centuries later, you find a very different range of representations. So, monks and Buddhas are forever laughing. They are very fat, unlike our very slim and stern-looking Buddhas. They're fat and they're full of fun, and they seem to be having a really good time. So the point is that the rules of emotion within the same Asian religion can actually be very different, depending upon what we are looking at. In South Asia, the Buddhas look very different from the Buddhas in East Asia. Now, talking of somber stuff, I think nothing can be more somber than what you see in one part of the Mahabharat. In the Mahabharat, in the Sabha Parva, you actually have laughter becoming very serious and very dangerous because of the repercussions. I think many of you would remember the point where Duryodhan confronts his cousins. He's actually visiting Indraprasth, and he's of course full of envy at what he sees around there. But he's also very resentful because on several occasions, he becomes the object of ridicule. So there's this beautiful lake with crystal clear water, and Duryodhan thinks that this is hard land. So he falls into it with all his clothes on. And of course, the brothers are looking on, and you have Bhim and Arjun laughing uncontrollably, and many menials from the palace also join in. And this happens on a number of occasions. And of course, when Duryodhan goes away from Indraprasth, he's really furious. And he complains about this first to Shakuni and then to Dhritarashtra. And it's out of this, the fact that he was the butt of laughter, that it's decided to use Yudhishthir's weakness for dice. And of course, when you have the dice game and the humiliation of Draupadi, you then have the whole tale, of the Mahabharat war unraveling. And there's very few reasons to laugh. So the consequences of laughter can actually be extremely serious, historically speaking. Laughing out loud is bad in Buddhist literature, but it's also not a particularly good thing to laugh at anybody in the Mahabharat. Now, this kind of laughter that you see, and of course, Duryodhana is an anti-hero, but you see some of this, the consequences of this even in Christianity. So the great scholar of Greek laughter, Stephen Halliwell, he's actually spoken about the fact that in the New Testament, nobody ever laughs. And he says that this is because, as a matter of fact, when Christ was going to be taken for his crucifixion, Pontius Pilate handed over Christ to his soldiers, who then put on a purple robe on Christ and this crown of thorns, and they hit him on the head and they jeered him and they mocked him. And then, of course, they took him for his crucifixion. So the point is that laughter in the context of Christ's crucifixion is again very, very demeaning. And that's why there's a general suspicion of laughter in early Christianity. So yes, cultures can be different, but you also find often the same kind of ways of thinking across cultures. And this is something that is very, very meaningful for me, at least, when I look at laughter in antiquity. Now, I think we've had enough of somber stuff and the dangerous consequences of laughter. Why don't we move on now to look at love? As a historian and as somebody who deals often with prehistory, I would begin with the question, which is, where is the earliest expression of love found? It's actually found in prehistory. It comes from Ain Sakri, which is near Bethlehem in Palestine. And this particular sculpture that you see is of the Natufian culture. It's at a point in time when hunter-gatherers are just moving on to domesticating plants and animals. And this is 11,000 years old, approximately. And it's a calcite pebble which has actually been shaped into two people embracing each other or even making love. Who were these people? The question I would put to you is, what was their gender? Many people have responded in the debates around this figure by saying that this is a man and a woman. But my point is that this could also be just two men. It could be two women. And the gender, in fact, here, the sex of the two figures is left, I would say, deliberately ambiguous. And this, in fact, brings home another point, which is that we should not use our own values to actually look at ancient societies and ancient expressions of emotions. Often, heterosexuality is not a default option. In human cultures in the past, just as in human societies in the present, there were a variety of relationships, and therefore what you see here could be a man and a woman, but they could also be two people of the same sex locked in a very close physical embrace or even in the act of copulation. Now, these figures that you see on the screen, these are actually people who we don't know. They're not historically recognizable. We don't know their names, for instance. So when do you actually find the first historically recognizable people speaking about love. In the West, actually, you find this quite often in the graffiti at Pompeii. Now, today, we often talk about roadside Romeos, but in Pompeii, in Italy, you had a lot of, and this is the first century of the Common Era, you had a lot of wall-side Romeos who scribbled all kinds of graffiti on the walls. Fortunately for us, that graffiti has survived very well, because remember, Pompeii was actually destroyed by this big volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. But just let's look at the graffiti for a moment. So on the walls of one house, you have this message: I love my sweetest and most beloved Tane very much. In another house, in the atrium, you actually learn about Secundus, who is writing to his beloved Prima, sending her a cordial salute, and he's asking that his feelings of love be reciprocated. He says, I ask, dear lady, that you love me. Love is also seen in some of this graffiti as being an unstoppable force. So on one street in Pompeii, you have this message: if somebody here reprehends the lovers, let them equally try to stop the winds and prohibit the running of waters from their source. There's also a lot of sexually salacious graffiti in Pompeii. And I would ask all of you who are interested in Pompeii and these ancient messages to read a wonderful book by Mary Beard called Fires of Vesuvius, where much of this is elaborated in absolutely fabulous and prose, and which is full of laughter and, of course, love. But what about India? Do you actually have any kind of graffiti in India? Believe it or not, we do have a particular message, and it's of historical people expressing their love for each other a few centuries before what you see in Pompeii. This comes from the Chattisgarh forests. In Chattisgarh, you have this Ramgarh hill, which is not very far from Ambikapur. And in the thick forests there of Surguja, you have this particular inscription. It's an inscription in the Brahmi script, and it's found inside a cave that is called the Jogimara cave. You can see this is the cave from the outside. And if you look at the translation of the message, this is what the Jogimara cave inscription says. Shutanuka, a Devadasi, Shutanuka by name, a Devadasi, the excellent among young men loved her, the sculptor named Devadina. So Shutanuka, her name comes twice, and she's obviously loved by this sculptor named Devadina. Now, this particular cave in which this inscription is, has, or at least used to have, a lot of very elaborate paintings. So it's possible that this sculptor was also a painter. But quite apart from this, what were the two of them doing in these forests? Were they living in this cave, or were they living in a city nearby? Which temple was Shutanuka associated with? She's after all a Devdasi. We actually don't have answers to these questions. But what we do know is that the love that is expressed here included, it certainly included sexual love, because the word that is used for love comes from kama. Now, how is this different from other expressions of love in India? Now, generally speaking, when you think of love, you think of the Kama Sutra, certainly when you think of love making. And there's a lot going for love making in the Kama Sutra, including how much attention the text asks men to pay to the sexual needs of women. You also have the plays of Kalidas, the great kavya of that great, this wonderful playwright. But, when you think about their writings, they're not talking about historical people. And of course, beyond this, you also have all kinds of coupling represented in sculpture. From Khajuraho, from Konarak. You can also have sculpture showing again intimacy, which is much less explicit than this. This is my most favorite couple from the Vidisha Museum. I like this couple because both of them have their arms around each other. But what is most intimate is the affectionate way in which the man's toes are actually covering his beloved's toes. But even this, for all the beauty of the emotions expressed, we really don't know who these people were. Were they real? Were they just representations? If texts are prescriptive, these representations also are about anonymous people and anonymous sculptors also most of the time. On the other hand, if you look at this particular epigraph, it's so different. It's so different because we know the names of the couple. They're very ordinary people. They don't belong to royalty. Remember, this is the time when a great emperor in India, Emperor Ashoka, uses the very script to make these regal proclamatory edicts that are put all over India. But this message is very different. Like Ashok, Devadina and Shutanuka are also putting their own emotions out, in the public domain. But they're doing it in a far more intimate way. And what strikes me is that they are doing it completely unencumbered by either caste or by religion. So, the manner in which this intimacy is made public in a very short message in the 3rd century BC appears to me in some senses to be very modern. It's like, for me, the ideal of a romantic couple. And it's for this reason that I often think of Shutanuka and Devadina being really the ideal couple of ancient India. So this brings me to the end of my presentation. In conclusion, what I've tried to do here is to really talk about why the study of politics and religious institutions may be important, but why emotions matter, why love and laughter matter, and how you can study love and laughter in the past. And this, of course, was beautifully put by Octavio Paz, this famous Mexican Nobel laureate, who said the same thing in much better words, where he spoke about the fact that if philosophical and scientific ideas, if social patterns are actually integral to our understanding of what our civilization has been, why shouldn't the same be true for the study of our feelings, both imaginary and real, for 1,000 years? I would just make one amendment to what Paz says. I would say that why for 1,000 years? For more than 10,000 years. So I'm now going to wait for your comments and questions, and I'm going to hand over this to Jahanara Raza. Hi, Jahanara, can you hear me?
Hi,
Jahanara is an alumna of Ashoka University, and I want to thank her for doing this, coordinating the questions and answers, and being a part of this beyond the classroom with me.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here because this talk was phenomenal, especially the way you curated vast sources from across cultures and across time periods in the ancient world. So I think our audience will be really enjoying that. We will now begin questions. We've got a lot of questions coming in from the audience. So we're going to select a few themes and touch upon them first. To begin with, Professor, I'd like to ask you, why is it that emotions such as love and laughter have been marginalized when we study history? Why have they been relegated to the boundaries of this discipline?
So I think love and laughter haven't mattered so much to to historians and to scholars of the past in quite the same way as politics and religion have, or for that matter, society. It has something to do with what we consider as important, in past cultures. So if you think about it, it's not just love and laughter. If you think about great people, it's mainly great men who used to be talked about. Women have entered into the historical world, I would say, in the last 30 years or so. So, there are lots of things which were thought as being on the margins. And I would say that love and laughter still is very much, on the margins, except that you now have some great literature, modern history books that have been produced, which can be used by people like me when, this teaching is done. But I think there's a sense of emotions not mattering so much in history. So let's take something like the Great War or the World War I, as it used to be first called before World War II happened. Now, when you talk of the Great War, you talk about the causes of the war, you talk about the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, you speak about the humiliation of Germany in the end, the Treaty of Versailles, and so on. But do you talk of the dead? Do you talk of the fact that actually the World War also brought grief into practically every household in Europe? And the fact that much of the people who died were very young people, and their bodies, as in the case of the English soldiers who died, couldn't even have been shipped back home. So there wasn't even something physical around which you could grieve. But this grief, emotion, is something that doesn't even come up when you talk about something like a big war. So love and laughter don't figure, but so don't a lot of other emotions. And I think some of that is now changing.
Glad to know it's changing. But a participant had a question to ask, are women historically considered unfunny? Like when you talk about humor, especially in the ancient world, um, is there a lack of female representation?
I think that's a really good question. It's true. If you think about it, I'm thinking, as I'm speaking about, for example, the plays of Kalidas, and you will not find Shakuntala, cracking a joke in the way in which Vidushika does. And none of the jesters, the equivalent of, court jesters in India, the Vidushikas, are actually women. So, you don't have so many funny women, but you do have some. So there is a play which was written by Mahindra Vikrama Pallava king called the Matta Vilasa Prahasana. And in that, you actually have this drunk Shaivite woman accompanying, a Shaiv religious man, and she's actually quite funny. So I don't think we can say, we can make a blanket statement that there aren't funny women, but certainly it's true that women don't figure expressing their humor in quite the same way as men do.
Thank you. So moving from gender to the idea of class, historically in the ancient world, coming back to humor, is it that most of the jokes are made on the upper class and the downtrodden making jokes on them would be considered mean? What is the class dynamic of the way humor has been written about and subsequently studied?
Yeah, so this is something that Plutarch said, many centuries ago, that if there is an emperor who is poking fun at a slave, that's not funny. But a slave or a menial can poke humor on somebody above his station or her station, and that is funny. So yes, it's true. There is a class dynamic, and somebody very high up in the social, ladder, really, it wasn't proper for him or her to actually poke fun at somebody who was lower down. But having said that, I mean, think about it. Mahendra Vikrama, who I mentioned, he's poking fun at all religious people who are all ultimately below him. And the play is really funny. But then he doesn't figure there. He doesn't figure there as a ruler. If he figured there as a ruler and he was seen poking fun, would it be funny? I don't think so.
Okay, thank you. And now moving to another culture which is right next door, the laughing Buddha. What's the story behind it? And why is it that they laugh there and we don't laugh here as much?
So I think when you look at early Buddhism and you think of the Buddha trying to actually create an order, a sangha, an order of monks or an order of nuns and so on and so forth, this is really, something which is evolving in those years. And there are monks who come and acquire great riches, and then he comes up with these rules which tell you that all that you can have is a begging bowl, and just enough in that begging bowl that would fill your hands and so on. So there are all these rules which are evolving, and for him in those in the 6th century BC, it was very important to put forward a kind of message that, as a matter of fact, it was necessary to be aloof, to exercise restraint. That's central to Buddhism. But I think when you're looking at East Asia, there is already there a culture of laughter on which Buddhism is grafted. And therefore, they bring this in. This happens all the time. So, when we say, oh, well, our great religion from India has gone and colonized the world, the fact of the matter is they've taken those bits out of it, which makes sense to them in terms of their own culture, and they've grafted on other things which are not there in the original religion. And that happens with great figures and so on and so forth. So I think one should think of religions and the movement of religions in a much more nuanced way. It's not as if there's a wholesale transfer and that what should be in India would be somewhere else. It doesn't happen. Look at the way we use English. I'm sure the English would be, and they'd be really alarmed about what happens in America with the language. So origins is one thing, but what eventually happens to cultural phenomena is quite something else.
So talking about language, the language of love, in the ancient world, especially in India, looked at erotic love. And over the years, talking about erotic love has kind of become a taboo. Like, how did that happen for us? Like, what did we graft upon or leave behind?
So I think we become, over time, far more intolerant. I would say that intolerant also of a variety, intolerant of also what our past is all about. So we want our past to actually mirror the present. And the whole point of history is that it is different. The pasts of India are very different from the present. And that's the way, it should be. But if you treat the past, with faith and not with reason, if you're looking for values in the past and you're not doing it to actually explore how human life evolved and changed over millennia, you're bound to face these problems. Now, historically, how did this happen? I think some of it has happened in the last 200 years. Maybe, the influence of Christianity. the fact that all religions, it's not just that, all religions became far more Protestant. So if you look at 19th century Buddhism, it was very alarmed by the fact that there were all these practices which weren't there in the early texts. The same was true for Sikhism. So there was an attempt to purify all these faiths. And I think that really speaks. There are reasons for it, but that's something we've imbibed. And we are very sort of sure about the fact that, well, this is what the past was all about. And we don't actually celebrate the fact that the past is very different. The lessons we should learn from the Kama Sutra is actually that, the sexual needs of women matter. If you're approaching a woman when she is a virgin, do it the way in which Vatsyayan says, which is that you can spend many nights with her without making love. You can just embrace her and kiss her and talk to her. So, it's those sorts of nuances which are just so interesting and very different from what you see around. But for me, the most alarming thing is to imagine that the past is like the present. It isn't. It's not meant to be either. Then what's the point of studying history?
Thank you. We're going to come to the last question. And this time I'm going to ask you about the bhakti movement. And what do you have to say about the expression of love there? Because it's very different from the way it's spoken about in ancient India.
Yes, I think, there's a lot of erotic feeling which is expressed by many of the bhakti saints who portray themselves as lovers of the gods, the god to whom they are devoted. So for me, what is interesting about that kind of love is the fact that it doesn't require a mediator, because you're looking at, at a sacred space, and a sacred space which often used to be mediated by Brahmins and others and so on. And here with the bhakti saints, you don't require that kind of mediation. I don't want to say here, though, that we call it the bhakti movement, but remember, you're looking at a range of saints from the 7th, 8th centuries right up to the 17th century. So the idea of seeing them as a movement is a much later thing, because we are really looking at a range of bhakti saint poets. Their expressions of love are actually quite different from what you see. I would say that the world of antiquity, maybe, at least to me, seems far more interesting.
Thank you, Professor Nayanjot Lahiri. It was very enlightening. And I think the biggest takeaway for me was that history cannot be uniform and should not. Otherwise, why should we study it in the first place? It was lovely having you.
So thank you, Jahara, for moderating this. And I also want to thank the audience for all their questions. This has been a great experience for me, and I hope, I can do this again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. On behalf of Ashoka University, I would like to thank all of you for participating in Seminar 2 of Beyond the Classroom. We really loved your comments and your questions. We'd really love to have your feedback, and right when the session ends, a screen is going to pop up. And on that screen, there will be a feedback survey. Please tell us what you think. Lastly, I would like to remind you that every Wednesday and Saturday at 8:30 p.m., Ashoka University is going to bring you a new session of Beyond the Classroom. Follow us on Instagram and on Facebook to know about the future updates. And lastly, don't forget to check your emails, because we're going to write to you about this seminar. Have a great night and see you this Saturday beyond the classroom. Thank you for watching.